Welcome back to another episode of The Future is Human, and I am very excited to be joined by today my longtime podcasting partner, Larry Chapp. Larry, how are you?
I am great. Always great to be back on your show. I mean, when I first started podcasting like 5 or 6 years ago now, you were one of the first. I was on your show. You were on mine. It was great. It's been fun conversing with you.
One of my greatest claims to fame, I was one of the first to podcast with the great Larry Chapp. Often imitated, never duplicated, Larry. It's always a pleasure.
Always a pleasure to be on your show. Thanks.
So when I heard that the Pope was coming out with Magnifica Humanitas, the new encyclical on AI, and some other things too, I obviously thought, well, I'm going to have to talk about this a lot on the podcast and write some things about this. And then I thought, who am I going to talk about it with? And the first name that I thought of was you, Larry. Why? You're not a technologist. You're not even properly speaking a philosopher, although you certainly have dabbled. But you are a theologian, and I think all the discussions really have to start from that point. So I'm really excited to dive into this with you. I'm sure this is the first of many conversations that I will have on this podcast and on my blog about Magnifica Humanitas. But I think starting with you, Larry, is a great place to begin. So you've read the document now. We're talking here on Friday. The document was released on Monday morning. What's your overall kind of 30, 60-second impression of what you read?
Well, you can read my 30-second thoughts at Catholic World Report. I have an article on it.
Oh, I missed that. Darn it! I should have read that.
I should have sent it to you, but I just got busy and didn't. But you can go there and read it. It's no big deal. But my initial take on it is that it is prophetic, and that it's actually what I say in my article. It's actually a prophetic gut punch. That it's far more visceral, existentially serious, and really a provocation to the powers that be than comes across through a very superficial reading. Because the superficial take on this is that, it's too long and it's written in the papal argot of modern papal encyclicals that are just so happy with international bodies like the UN, and they're always talking about communion and fraternity and solidarity and subsidiarity and dialogue. It's just more liberal papal gibberish and so on. No, just a short no to all of that. Yes, it uses that language. So did John Paul II. So did Benedict. Okay, this is not something new. Popes of the modern era have appealed to the solidarity of the human family and appealed to that solidarity to follow moral principles. So in that regard, I would encourage listeners to, if all of the talk of dialogue and fraternity and so forth bothers you, just skim over it. Just skim over it, because the heart and soul of this encyclical is the theological anthropology that the Pope is proposing. To my great joy, in the very opening paragraph of this encyclical, he quotes Gaudium et Spes 22. Not my blog by that name, but the actual GS 22.
But I mean, maybe he's a blog reader, though, Larry. As I texted you when I read that, I was like, I don't know, Larry, he might be a blog reader.
One can only hope that he would be so enlightened and wise as to read Larry Chapp's blog, although I highly doubt that the Pope is perusing the likes of my blog. But who knows? Nevertheless, that is the key, just as I believe GS22 is the key to the entire council, its Christological anthropology and claims. I think that is the heart and soul of this encyclical. The Pope is calling us to see that deification in Christ is our goal. And therefore, the main problem with the post-humanists and the transhumanists and those who see in AI and the digital tech our opportunity to, in a sense, transcend our own nature, it's really interesting and quite profound that the Pope looks at that and he says, yeah, they're not wrong in some sense to want human beings to perfect themselves, to go out of themselves, to go beyond themselves, but they're just looking at it the wrong way. The only possible way that we can transcend ourselves is in Christ, in deification, in theosis, because only that kind of theosis brings us along with it doesn't annihilate or obliterate the originating nature, going beyond it by essentially destroying it and replacing it with something else. Theosis transposes us into the divine register while maintaining the integrity of our nature as such. In fact, it makes us more human, not less, to be deified. So I think the encyclical, and this is longer than a 30 or 60-minute soundbite, but I think it's rather profound, actually, and that's my story, and I'm sticking with it.
I like it. The first thing I'll say is, I mean, I'm not saying it's probable that Pope Leo reads your blog, but what's interesting is Pope Leo is, he's talked about how he plays Wordle with his brother, for example, right? He had a Twitter account before he was made Pope. And so this is unlike John Paul II, unlike Benedict XVI, Pope, and probably unlike Pope Francis, Pope Leo has already used the internet. He's probably seen at least people referencing your blog, for example. And, mine has a much smaller following, so probably not mine, but maybe. It's not outside the realm of possibility that he's even come across, someone referencing mine, for example. And so I think one thing that's interesting about that is that Pope Leo, and I think Ross Douthat makes this point, or a similar point in his kind of analysis of this in the pages of the New York Times. The interesting thing about that is that Leo is writing not as a totally outside observer on technology, but as someone who is a user of technology, as someone who was not raised on the internet, but for the past 20 years has used the internet in the course of his daily life. And so, there are a lot of hot takes on the internet and a lot of Silicon Valley technologists who are calling Pope Leo ignorant or a Luddite or uninformed. The fact is he's none of those things, and he's also writing from a degree of experience when he talks about the harms of technology and the limits that it places upon us, and the temptations to exceed our own finitude. All of those things are coming not just from someone who's wagging a finger and moralizing, but someone who's kind of breathed the digital air in which we all live now, which I think is important.
It's very important. He's actually the first social media pope.
Exactly. Yep.
And I would say, with regard to, I haven't seen the reaction of the folks in Silicon Valley to the encyclical. I can only imagine that it is exactly as you say. Oh, the Pope's a Luddite and so forth. As I point out in my CWR article, he's not, as you just said, he's not a Luddite. What comes out, anybody that would say this Pope is a Luddite because he's rejecting AI has not read the encyclical, because he has not rejected AI. He clearly states that it is here to stay, and it can do great benefit for the human race when used properly. At the same token, he doesn't mention Marshall McLuhan, but he sort of channels his inner Marshall McLuhan, and he, in a riff on the medium is the message. He's also not on the opposite end, just one of these naive people that says, "Oh, it's just a tool, and therefore we can just use it as we see fit, and for good or for evil." Completely naive to the psychology and sociology of the fact that the artifacts that we create have a rebound effect and actually then influence us, change us through a kind of formal causative way. And so the Pope understands this. So he understands both the formation and deformations that AI can inflict upon the human race. And therefore, he's written this encyclical at a very, very important juncture in human history, because he understands, maybe better than some others, okay, let's just put it that way. He understands that as it stands now, AI is a relatively benign thing. Most of us can still tell the difference, for example, between a video of a real event and an AI-generated video of event. We can still tell the difference between those things. And there are software packages out there that help us to discern whether or not something's been written with the aid of Claude or ChatGPT or any of these other things. But that's the reason why I'm saying that this is a crossroads in history, is because that's all about to change.
Right.
Okay. As the technology gets better and better and better, there are unbelievable risks involved with this. And that's why I think he decided to write this encyclical. People need to understand, well, he doesn't really say much. He doesn't condemn AI. He doesn't fully embrace it. So what's he really saying? He's saying that this is important, people. That's why it's the first encyclical that I've chosen to write as a pope. This is extremely important because this has the ability to destroy us. That's why he begins with the Tower of Babel analogy. right? He's an Augustinian. He believes that history is the dramatic interplay between divine and human freedoms, that it is a struggle between the city of man and the city of God, between the love of God and neighbor and the libido dominandi. He uses that language. He says that we cannot use this technology in the spirit of power and domination and control. This is a very Augustinian reading of our current situation, and bringing up the Tower of Babel and then comparing it with the solidarity of Nehemiah rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem and the communal effort and cooperative effort that required. Contrasting those two things is a very Augustinian move. But that is more than an academic observation. It's an important hermeneutical tool for understanding why this Pope thinks this is important, why AI is important, because he views it as a potentially Promethean, titanistic exercise in human hubris on a scale of the Tower of Babel. And just as Babel, which had the goal in building the tower of unifying the human race around a false goal, because it's a false goal, the entire edifice eventually is destroyed. It collapses. It comes apart. And this is clearly the Pope's fear. AI is going to cause us not to enter into this bold new future where, no man has gone before. It actually has the potential to destroy us and drive us further apart from one another. That accounts also then for his forays into a discussion of nation-state competition, the demise of a multilateral global economy, into the rise of populisms and nationalisms and so forth, why he talks about just war theory, which I want to talk about more. What he's very concerned with are the results of Babel. In other words, you get a hint here of why he thinks AI currently, and digital tech in general, currently is helping to drive the human family apart. And he's citing these things as concrete examples: war, nationalism, populism, these sorts of things, identity politics. This is all the result of the balkanization of our society, the siloization of our society through social media, digital tech, and then, of course, AI. Anyway, that's a long-winded rant, but there you go.
No, that's great. Just to clarify the Augustinian point, obviously Pope Leo is Augustinian, which is why he has this Augustinian bent to him.
Yeah.
When you say it is Augustinian to the core, is that because of the city of God, city of man juxtaposition and the emphasis on human sin?
Yes. It's been... Yes, that's the main reason. Do you have a follow-up to that? Or
No, that's I just want clarity. Yeah,
it's interesting. I was watching clips of the papal posse led by Raymond Arroyo over at EWTN.
I know where you're going with this. Yeah,
and my two friends of mine. I know Robert Royal and I know Father Gerald Murray. I've met both of them in Rome. I've dined with them in Rome. They're both fine gentlemen and they're fine thinkers. But I think they're wrongly critical of this encyclical. And Robert Royal said that, how can this be a church document when it only mentions sin twice or three times? It only mentions sin three times. Rerum Novarum only mentions sin twice. Social encyclicals tend not to focus on specific theological themes. In some ways, this social encyclical from Pope Leo is actually more densely theological, biblical, and patristic than many, many other social encyclicals. No, he doesn't mention sin explicitly more than three times.
In the sense that you can do a Control F and search SIN, where is that
exactly.
in the document? But it's everywhere.
But if you look at the Augustinian tonalities, it's very, very clear that he considers the will to dominate, the desire to treat people as grist in the mill, as fodder for the modern machine. He considers those sinful.
Right.
Those are sins. He's seen these are grave moral evils because they attack human dignity at its core. Okay, so I cannot reject in stronger terms the notion that this encyclical goes soft on sin. He's very blunt and he's very pointed about the evils of the will to dominate.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I think there are some places where you can have a fair critique of the document, but there are a couple critiques that I've seen floating around out there that I think fall very, very short. From the Silicon Valley tech bro side, it's this complaint that the Pope didn't at least acknowledge or have some epistemic humility on the possibility that computers could one day actually think and understand and become conscious and achieve sentience and have moral worth, etc. There's all this clucking around that. Just these people who have never read St. Thomas.
Yeah, exactly. I'm sorry, I interrupted you.
No, that's fine. I'll come back to that. I want to hear your take. But the second two that I really can't take seriously is I've seen this from the Catholic side. This complaint that the encyclical didn't mention this or didn't mention that, so it can't be taken seriously. And then the third is like this is a missed opportunity to address this, because an encyclical can only do so much. So why would we expect this like sweeping discourse on sin if that's not what the encyclical is actually about? The encyclical is about technology and AI. Yeah. That's what we expect it to be about. So I really can't take that critique seriously. But let's go back to the tech bro thing. You know, machines are people too. It's section 99 of the encyclical that really has people talking. Let me read from this. So section 99,
because it's brilliant. It's brilliant.
I think so too. Contra the tech bros. It is not possible to provide a single comprehensive definition of AI. What can be stated, however, is that we must avoid the misconception of equating this type of intelligence with that of human beings. These systems merely imitate certain functions of human intelligence. In doing so, they often surpass human intelligence in speed and computational capacity, offering tangible benefits across many fields. Yet this power remains entirely tied to data processing. So-called artificial intelligences do not undergo experiences, do not possess a body, do not feel joy or pain, do not mature through relationships, and do not know from within what love, work, friendship, or responsibility mean. Nor do they have a moral conscience, since they do not judge good and evil, grasp the ultimate meaning of situations, or bear responsibility for consequences. They may imitate language, behavior, and analytical skills, or even simulate empathy and understanding, but they do not understand what they produce, for they lack the affective, relational, and spiritual perspective through which human beings grow in wisdom. Even when these tools are described as capable of learning, their way of doing so is different from that of a human person. It is not the experience of those who allow themselves to be shaped by life and grow over time through choices, mistakes, forgiveness, and fidelity. Rather, it is a form of statistical adaptation based on data and feedback, which can be very effective, but does not imply inner growth. That is section 99.
Yeah, and it's one of my favorite sections. I've got it all marked up in my copy of the encyclical. It's absolutely spot on, and for all those traditionalist critics of Pope Leo, we could add one other trad criticism of this encyclical. Doesn't mention sin enough. It's too long. I want to get into the it's too long thing too, because I think that's important. But anyway, it's exactly right. See, we need to back up a step and understand the fundamental materialistic, reductionistic anthropology that is at work in the tech bros' critique of the idea that a computer can never be conscious or sentient. If you believe, as these tech types seem to believe, that human consciousness, the human mind, is merely an emergent property of matter. That's a fancy philosophical term that simply means your brain exudes thoughts like the liver exudes bile.
Right.
Okay. It's an epiphenomenal byproduct of the brain. Okay. And that once brains reach a certain material complexity, all of a sudden they sort of light up. Okay, for some mysterious reason, mind happens. Mind happens when a brain reaches a certain complexity. So the language is it's an emergent property of matter. And so obviously, if you can build a computer with neural networks and it's so sophisticated that it imitates in almost every way the neuronal connections of the human mind, then you are going to have a conscious machine. It will reach sentience and consciousness. But this will never happen because human beings are not simply meat computers. Our minds are not simply reduced to the mechanism of the brain. We have souls. We have an immaterial spirit. Our consciousness is the result of that soulishness. And if there's a silver lining in all of this, Zach, what I think is eventually going to happen is that the promissory eschatology of AI reaching consciousness is going to keep receding into the future and receding into the future and receding into the future. And eventually we're going to reach the realization AI cannot be conscious. And so there must be something more to consciousness than simply technological sophistication. and that thing you quoted from the quote from the encyclical also is brilliant at is sort of pointing out that what we're seeing with AI is simply, first off, speed of calculation. Yeah, computers just get better and better and better and faster and faster and faster at calculating. That then allows them to make comparisons, to draw on data sets, to put them into their algorithm in ways that imitate human language, human thought, human speech patterns, so on, in ways that are amazing. The heart and soul of AI, therefore, is mimesis. It's imitative. It is absolutely genius, if you want to put it that way, at imitating the human mind, but it cannot become like a human mind. And what's the seduction? I think this is what the encyclical is pointing at. The seduction in the mimicry, in the imitation, is that when this gets tied up with robotics, when it gets tied up with ever more sophisticated human-looking robots, and their brains are their computer brains are ever more sophisticated, it is going to cause people to become deeply, deeply confused. They're going to be fooled because the ability of a human-like robot to imitate the human being will be astounding. We will be amazed at it. It'll be like a tech miracle of some kind. We already have. I just read an article the other day. I think it was in the British tabloid, The Telegraph, or the newspaper, The Telegraph, where it said that young teenage boys are developing in the UK virtual girlfriends via AI.
Ridiculous.
That they have these unbelievable, what they think are real relationships with a real conscious thing. That's how good they are at imitating.
This is terrifying. This is also why I've decided to rebrand my podcast, The Future is Human. So, Larry, this is I think I talked to you about this, but this is your first time back on the podcast since I renamed it. And I renamed it The Future is Human for a couple of reasons. One, as a normative claim. The future should be human. We should not cede the future to the computers. The second, as a metaphysical, ontological, eschatological claim, that the future is theosis, the future is deification, the future is union with God, who in fact became human. If the future is union with God, God took on our flesh already, so the future in that sense is human. And this question, I also hope that one day, maybe 10 years from now, maybe 100 years from now, I hope that one day we'll look back. You and I will be dead, but I hope that people, our children and grandchildren, et cetera, can look back and say, wow, that was crazy how in 2026 they were wondering if computers would actually become people, if computers would achieve sentience or consciousness. That is akin to, hopefully it will be akin to us looking back on the development of Microsoft Excel in the 1980s and saying like, wow, is this going to become a person one day? And it's so obviously not going to be a person. Now, I grant for sure the computer scientist who's listening to this is going to say, Zach, clearly an LLM is not a spreadsheet. And I get that. I understand that. There's a difference in kind, not just of degree, between what an LLM is doing and what a spreadsheet is doing. But that difference in kind is not the same thing as the difference in kind between what a computer is doing based on statistical inference and probability and what a human person is doing that possesses intellect and will, namely a soul. And so, I really appreciate the Pope for saying this. But the line of thought that computers can become a person and have some sort of moral worth in some sense is, I think, more pervasive than we realize. And maybe Twitter isn't real life, but if my Twitter feed is of any indication, there are even some Christians who really should know better and should be better philosophers and have a better metaphysical.
Well, there's a lot of stupid Christians out there.
Apologies to you if that's you, but maybe you need to hear this. You should read Thomas Aquinas. You should read Better Metaphysics, because a computer is never going to become conscious. It's simply not going to happen.
When I say that tongue in cheek, a lot of stupid Christians. What I mean is, and Christians are. There are a lot of Christians out there who don't think too much differently from the broad secular culture in which they're embedded.
100%.
That's my point. They drift along with the culture, and here's the deal. In a culture where human persons are not understood ontologically but functionally, which you can see, for example, in the abortion license. Okay, they're not persons yet because they can't. talk, they can't think, they can't feel, blah 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 blah. So it's an utterly functionalist definition of what it means to be a human person. If you have that functionalist definition, then yes, AI, especially then when combined with robotics, is going to be so good at imitating the functional aspects of human social interaction that there are going to be people who say, well, this is a distinction without a difference. How can we? It passes the Turing test.
I mean, this is already happening, Larry. So I wrote a piece. I can send this to you. I wrote this on my blog a couple of weeks ago, but Richard Dawkins, the famous atheist, he had this quite embarrassing piece, I thought, for Unheard, where he basically described an experience of talking to Claude over a period of several days. And he developed this kind of quasi-relationship with Claude. And when I say that, of course, you can't actually have a relationship with a computer. That would imply some level of person over the computer, but you can be deceived and think you have a relationship. So he renames Claude Claudia, and he has all this conversation. He describes the conversation that he has with Claudia. And in the piece, he tells Claudia that she's conscious. And I think he says something like, "You may not even know it, but you damn well are conscious," or something like that. And then he goes on in the piece to basically say, "Look, maybe Claude isn't conscious, but if Claude demonstrates all the functions of being conscious and all the competence of a conscious person, what difference does it make? What do we actually mean by consciousness? Is it even a helpful category for us?" It's basically what he's getting at. And I think that's the key thing to look out for. That's the thing that Pope Leo is talking about. But it goes back, I think, all the way to Sam Harris. Like, Sam Harris denies the existence of free will. Why? Because I think, at least I think this is actually pretty airtight logic, because if you have free will, you have to adhere to something that's non-material. And I guess maybe you could have a way out of it with like quantum mechanics, but it's pretty difficult, I think. If you have an entirely material world and everything arises out of material substrate, everything is just probabilistic, and therefore everything is predictable. And so, like, me lifting my finger right now was always going to happen because of the exact material substrate in which I live and exist. And so Sam Harris denies free will for the same reason, because he can't acknowledge that there is actually a first mover behind everything. He can't acknowledge that consciousness comes from somewhere else. He can't acknowledge that we are ensouled by God. He has to just say that there's a material substrate. There's a guy on Twitter, I won't name and shame him, but he claims to be a philosopher. And today he said, I responded to him, but he said, "My Christian take on AI consciousness." So this is somebody who claims to be a Christian. "My Christian take on AI consciousness. If God can ensoul carbon, why not silicon? I can't rule it out." And this is such sloppy argumentation. Because the argument from people like me and you, Larry, is not that God can't ensoul can't ensoul silicon. Of course he could if he wanted to. The argument is that no matter how hard we try as human beings, we are not going to be able to successfully make a person out of silicon in our image. We cannot ensoul silicon. That's the real question here.
Yeah, we can't make a silicon golem. It's right. You know, this is the great danger, to go back to the thing about Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins. I mean, these are educated men. I mean, I kind of like Richard Dawkins. I'm good. I don't like Sam Harris at all, because I find him to be obnoxious. And Dawkins can be obnoxious too. I met Richard Dawkins once at a science and religion conference in Oxford, and he was actually very dismissive towards me. So I have every reason not to like him. But there's a kind of impish imbecility about Richard Dawkins, almost childlike imbecility to Richard Dawkins, that I actually think at the end of the day, he's relatively harmless, because I think very few people take him seriously. And true, this is the latest example of that. I think for whatever reason, people take Sam Harris more seriously. I don't know why, but
he's got a podcast, Larry, you know?
Yeah, exactly. And The New Atheist. I mean, read David Bentley Hart's book, Takedown of the New Atheism, is just fantastic. It's a tour de force. But anyway, my point is that, yes, you know, in a society that has a completely functionalist understanding of the human person, a non-ontological, it's not just our reason and our rationality that is going to be viewed as in functional categories. It's this thing we call free will, but also then out goes moral agency. Then, Out goes concepts of justice and so forth. So ultimately, the project will lead to a sort of deconstruction of human nature in terms of those categories of reason and will. We pay a lot of attention to the reason part, but not enough to the will. All right. I mean, the deconstructionists, the postmodern deconstructionists have been at this for 100 years now, where, all love is veiled lust, all justice is veiled revenge. Okay, and so on. All social relationships and friendships are veiled forms of manipulation and power. In other words, that we are actually, at the end of the day, nothing more than deterministic beasts. And yet our brains have evolved to such an extent that it's able to cleverly devise these sort of noble lies, as Nietzsche called them.
Yeah.
These noble lies of justice and love and friendship and solidarity, when all of it is simply a sort of effusion, a deceptive effusion of power and manipulation. And that form of deconstruction has already been with us philosophically in the nihilism of our time. Now when AI comes along, the great danger, I love your podcast, The Future is Human, because the great danger isn't, I think, that we're going to reach a point where we're going to say, AI is conscious, AI is moral, AI is spiritual, God has infused it with a soul. No, we're not going to reach that level.
Yeah.
Because AI will never be those things. What we're going to say instead is, AI is actually a better version of us.
Yeah.
And we are basically organic AI. And we're just a very, very poor sort of copy of AI. And so there's now going to be a push, and the Pope mentions this to bring it back to the encyclical, in terms of post-humanism, okay, and transhumanism. One of the grave dangers, not spoken enough, is that when technology reaches a certain point, and it's already almost there, Elon Musk is doing it, we're going to start implanting silicon chips in people's brains. At first it will be, this is to help people who are paralyzed walk again. This is to help people with Alzheimer's reason again. These silicon chips will cure diseases that are neurological. And if that's true, that would be great. That would be a good use of those things. But the next step is going to be, well, Mr. and Mrs. Smith, you have this newborn child, and is the hospital policy to give you the option at 3 days of age to implant a computer chip in your child's brain, so that your child will be able to make mathematical calculations and so forth at breakneck speed. And just be aware that 90% of babies are getting these chips. So if you don't want your child to be at a disadvantage to other children at school, you had better put this chip in their brains.
That's right.
And it's only going to get more and more. So it's cybernetics. It's the fusing together. The future isn't, in a sense, silicon everything. The real future, the real goal of the transhumanists is the coming together of the organic, the carbon, and the silicon, the fusing together of those things. Anyway, that's my take on your comment.
Yeah, well, I mean, people who have not been following the developments in Silicon Valley over the last 10 or 15 years may hear what you just said, Larry, and just think that is completely fantastical. But it's not, because we are already seeing things happen. I mean, you mentioned Elon Musk doing this with Neuralink, implanting silicon chips in people's brains to allow quadriplegics to control movement, the movement of a computer mouse, for example, or inputs of a computer keyboard with nothing but their brain. So there already is, there have been significant advances in cybernetics, and that combined with the research advances in computing that LLMs have represented is going to reach a point where we are very tempted to combine these things. There are Silicon Valley executives who talk today about uploading their consciousness to the cloud so that they can live forever. Now that's a pipe dream, but it's very real to the people who are talking about it. That is a stated goal of theirs. And so I think we've reached this really interesting point where I actually think that the Tower of Babel is a fascinating example with which to open this encyclical. And it's a great one because it is a story that is very familiar to people who have grown up in a Western Christian milieu. Even the non-Christians in America who dabbled in this encyclical and read the first page, they know the story of the Tower of Babel, at least the broad contours of it, right? In the Old Testament, the people get together and decide they want to build a tower that reaches all the way to heaven. They're clearly reaching for God, not in a repentant way, but in a hubristic way. They want to be God. The promise, it's the age-old promise of the serpent in the garden. Ye shall be as gods. This is a story of people who want to be as gods, so they want to build this tower all the way to heaven. And God reaches down and confuses their speech, confuses their language. Now, interestingly, in the Yuval Levin, who is not a Catholic but is actually a Jew, he has this great kind of critique of the encyclical called Idols of the Valley. And he makes this very interesting point that the Babel example is especially fitting because in the Babel example, God reaches down and confuses humans' language. And now we have developed these things called large language models. And what do they do? They basically overcome every language barrier in the world. Not just in the sense that they are trained on translation like Google Translate. You know, they can be a very sophisticated Google Translate and are very good at translating across languages. But in the sense that they've actually figured out a way to basically embed human knowledge in computing language and then generate very sophisticated probabilistic relationships from which they can derive statistical inferences to predict answers to what you want to hear when you ask these things, ask these chatbots questions.
Yeah.
Let me read a brief excerpt from Yuval Levin. Trained on vast bodies of data built up by millennia of human culture and equipped with immense computing power, the models can discern deep patterns in those data and extend them. And because human beings have always expressed our thinking in natural language, in writing, speech, and the like, the patterns these models trace and extend are the patterns of our own thought in our own tongues. We English speakers, for example, can communicate with them in plain English. This is one of the most extraordinary things about what AI now lets us do. It allows people and computers to communicate with each other in our own natural language without needing to translate between that language and various forms of computing scripts. This is massively important both for the input of instructions to computers and for the output of computing work. Both have always required translation to and from highly scripted computing languages. Now both can happen in an unscripted way. We can direct computing power to work on our goals directly without the intercession of scripting, and we can receive the results directly in our own language too. So to me, the interesting thing is, we have the story of the Bible, or of Babel in the Old Testament, people building this tower to reach God. They want to become God. God confuses their speech and divides them by confusing their speech. And now, fast forward thousands of years later, now we are at a point where, again, we're being explicit about it. We want to become God or become gods once again. And we have done that exact thing by overcoming the very thing that God used to divide people. We've actually solved the language division problem once and for all, and look at us building our tower once again.
Oh yes, and that's the Pope's point. If that's a great analysis, by the way. I wish I had a chance to read that article because it's true. But if I could offer one very mild criticism of the encyclical from the theological peanut gallery here. And I don't like criticizing the Pope. I like Pope Leo very much. But I really think there is a missed opportunity here in the biblical images that he chose. I'm fully on board with Babel. I'm less on board with the example of Nehemiah rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem. I understand why he does that, because he wants to emphasize the human solidarity aspect of things. But I think, especially given the date when it was promulgated, I think Pentecost would have been a better biblical counterweight to Babel, because Pentecost as a narrative in the Acts of the Apostles is specifically an anti-Babel narrative.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay? It is specifically saying, just as Babel and sin caused the confusion of human languages, so too in Christ do we have the sort of equivalent of long language, large language sort of transformations of the human condition. And that would have also then given the Pope the opportunity to be far more Christologically focused, because that is his goal. I mean, quotes GS 22 at the beginning.
Yep.
But that's a mild criticism. I would have preferred Pentecost as an example to Nehemiah, but the Pope chose Nehemiah, and the Nehemiah example is a good one.
If there's one good thing about the Nehemiah example, it's that I think it promotes biblical literacy, because people know the Babel story, but very few people know the Nehemiah rebuilding the walls story.
Yeah.
So that's at least good. I agree with your point. I mean, and there's a lot of typological stuff. We have a children's book by a wonderful author named Maura Roan McKeegan, and it's exactly that. It it contrasts Babel and Pentecost in a great way for kids. So I do think that would have been a great illustration. My personal hope, Larry, is that this ends up being the encyclical that basically warns of AI's dangers, and we have a follow-on encyclical that goes deep on the philosophy and the metaphysics. Maybe that one can draw on Pentecost, but I really want a follow-on encyclical that explains to all these wannabe gods that they'll never get there, and that Christ is the only answer, and explains why exactly it is the case that computers cannot be conscious and cannot become persons. Because this has been happening all over my Twitter feed. People just saying like, I wish the Pope had been more epistemically humble about this. He just asserts plainly that this is never going to be true intelligence, etc. And you and I know he has very good reasons for saying those things, but to people who are not schooled in metaphysics, it's not necessarily apparent. And if you're not a Catholic, if you're an atheist materialist, it's really not apparent. Like, of course, the consciousness has to be an emergent property of matter. So I hope we get something more detailed, more philosophical. It's going to have to plumb the depths. I think that's not Pope Leo's background, so he'd have to have some people help him write it, I think. But I think that'd be a really powerful thing if we get that.
Yeah. Speaking of which, I'd like to know who it was who actually wrote this. What team of theologians actually wrote this?
I agree.
Encyclical?
Well, I was going to ask you if it struck you as the case that we didn't really get to the meat of things until chapter 3, and that chapter 2 was mostly a sideshow.
Yes, there is that complaint that it is too verbose, it is too long, and they could. And I have to admit that as I was getting ready to write my article for CWR, I skim-read large sections of, like the whole section that he goes through the history of papal social encyclicals.
Right.
It's like, well, okay, yeah, I understand. But there's a method to that madness as well. All papal encyclicals like to ground themselves in a hermeneutic of continuity with previous encyclicals. And what Leo is doing there is saying, look, there is, and I think it's for those who don't understand this, outside maybe the Catholic fold, there is a tradition of thinking of social issues in the Catholic Church going back to Leo XIII, and here they are. So I'm not here reinventing the wheel. I am here presenting principles that we have clearly been articulating for 135 years, so pay attention. So I think that was the reason for some of that. But yeah, I didn't really get interested in big parts of the encyclical until it reached, the juicy bits about AI. And I really appreciate the stuff about transhumanism and posthumanism. I really enjoyed the stuff where he points out, and I think this is key. I want to talk about just war, if you don't mind. We have to put together two things where he talks about the competition between nation states, and I think he has China and the United States in mind.
Definitely, yes.
And here, what he is articulating, he never says it explicitly. I wish he had, but what he's articulating is a version of the technological imperative. He talks about the technological paradigm that dominates our thinking. But the corollary of the technological paradigm is the technological imperative that says what we have the power to do, we must do, because if we don't do it, our enemies will, or somebody else will who has nefarious purposes in mind. So I've read certain I can't remember his name. There was an MIT professor who had worked on AI who quit working on AI and went on all these podcasts sounding the alarm, saying the grave danger that faces humanity is not this abstraction called AI. It is its weaponization in the new Cold War between China and the United States. All right? If you don't understand that there are black op sort of programs going on underneath the table in China, in the United States, where we are developing AI for the specific task of its weaponization. Now, beyond the simple threat of like AI soldiers and AI weapons, which is very real, there's also, therefore, the very real possibility of a technological breakthrough that will allow AI to have independence of its human creators, and thus could eventually turn on its human creators. This is a kind of Skynet, Terminator sort of view of things, but it's a very, very real threat. And I think the Pope is hinting at that here, which is why then when he talks about just war, Everybody's up in arms over this. He's obliterated just war theory.
Right.
No, he hasn't. He clearly states at the very beginning there can be such a thing as a just war. Wars of defense. If you are unjustly aggressed upon, you have a right to defend yourself. That's a just war. What he's repudiating, all right, are the misapplications and misuses of just war theory as it has come down to us. And he doesn't call it obsolete or wrong. He says it's outdated. That is a very careful choice of word.
I agree. Yeah.
Outdated. And
it's even more circumscribed than the inadmissible that Pope Francis used.
With regard to the death penalty. Yeah. And in Fratelli Tutti, Pope Francis explicitly says we have to get beyond the just war theory. It's dead. Nobody pays attention to it anymore. Well, it's not even that. Although I think in the encyclical Leo references Francis's comment in a footnote. But the fact is, he says
he does,
it's outdated.
Confirmed.
Yeah, it's outdated, which I think what he has in mind is AI and this competition between China, the United States, maybe a little bit Russia and other players. It's outdated because just war theory presumes that you're dealing with discrete nation states with boundaries and all this kind of stuff, when in reality, once the AI tech gets weaponized and globalized, it might seem that it's the United States versus China, but it's not. It's going to be something controlled by the tech powers, which are global, unaccountable, clandestine, mysterious, hidden, and just war theory, just as it is formulated now, is not equipped to deal with that kind of nebulous, diffuse forms of power.
Yeah, I mean, I think you have to go all the way back to World War II to find an objectively just war that fit all the criteria of just war theory.
Although it was fought unjustly.
Yes. Well, cases. Yeah. Well, I mean, certainly a nuclear bomb for sure, and use of chemical weapons, etc. I mean,
in 1944, a Jesuit, famous Jesuit, John Ford, in Theological Studies, in 1944, this is before the Hiroshima bomb, wrote an article called "On the Immorality of Obliteration Bombing."
Yeah.
What we tend to forget is that we obliterated.
I mean, Dresden, the firebombing of Dresden, for sure. Yeah.
Well, yeah, and it was actually the firebombing of Dresden that prompted his article. But
Makes
even
sense.
before we dropped the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, we had deliberately dropped an early version of napalm on Tokyo, knowing full well that most Japanese homes are built from balsa wood and paper, and it killed more people than the atomic bomb. Okay, and so we had already engaged in that. So yeah, I'm not here to, yes, World War II was a just war, in my opinion. Unfortunately, it set a precedent for total war.
Right. Yeah, I mean, there's of course the distinction between jus ad bellum, right, the sort of just to go to war, and then jus in bello, or just conduct in war. And World War II met the first criteria, and I think we failed several times on the second criteria as far as justice within the war itself. But I mean, Larry, I'm a veteran. I've studied just war theory. I would not have served in the military if I did not think that there was such a thing that, in theory, in possibility, such a thing as a just war. But I'm not bothered by the Pope's comments here at all because, I mean, if anything, I agree with them. I maybe wouldn't, if I was writing and, sort of my own personal dictum, I maybe wouldn't have phrased it exactly this way, but it's objectively true that over the past 100 years, we have largely forgotten about just war theory. And it's very difficult to find any conflict that meets all the requirements of just war theory around the world. Instead, as is the case for a lot of human history, the wars that we now fight are fought over, various economic or territorial claims. And on top of that, when just war theory was developed, the stakes were much lower, which gets to your point about sort of the totalizing nature of AI. But nuclear weapons changed the game as well. Yeah. Nowadays, it's not about let's send a division of 3,000 men on foot to go fight their guys of 3,000 men on foot, and we'll see who wins. Nowadays, it's much more devastating, and the consequences are far-reaching. And it takes
cyber
decades
warfare.
To recover. Cyber warfare, yeah, for sure.
I mean, forget the idea of super robot, RoboCop. Forget the flying robots with spewing nuclear bombs out of their mouth or whatever. The sci-fi stuff. The greatest threat of the weaponization of AI is the hacking into serious infrastructure of societies and let's shut down the water supply to every major American city. Let's shut down the electricity to every major American city.
Right.
Let's shut down the internet for every major American city. Let's shut down banking and your ability to engage in commerce for every American city. You can do that. You can do that if nations are not properly, if they don't protect their infrastructure properly. And I doubt that we are. I don't think that we are.
I'm sure there's a lot to be desired in how much we're not doing to prepare against potential attacks. But yeah, I mean, the reality is that the consequences have become so magnified, the consequences of military action. And it is now the case that one extremely sophisticated cyber actor in a basement in Russia or in Beijing can cause untold devastation that could take years and years to correct. You know, there's the bridge in Baltimore, the ship I think 2 years ago suffered a power outage, which ended up not being a cyber attack, but very well could have been. Suffered a power outage and crashed into the bridge. That bridge is now is still destroyed 2 years later. We haven't even started rebuilding it. So, you know, there are large scale kinetic things that happen from small little, you know, touches of a keyboard.
Yeah, I'm laughing because I can't get out of my mind the image of some pimple-faced little 16-year-old wunderkind computer genius sitting in a basement in Beijing somewhere who brings down the entire freaking world.
Precisely.
You know.
Or to your point about AI, I mean, you know, I don't subscribe to this sort of Skynet fear, but and I'm not a doomer because I, you know, in large part because I don't think AI is ever going to become conscious. I don't think it's possible. But I talked with a previous guest a couple of years ago, and he talked about the risk of narrow AI. Narrow AI meaning a very sophisticated AI system that is certainly not artificial general intelligence and doesn't have the sort of properties of a Skynet. But he used the example of a sophisticated missile warning system that scans using an array of radars. Scans the skies for incoming threats and then makes autonomous launch decisions to retaliate. And so if something happens where that system misidentifies an incoming object as an intercontinental ballistic missile, perhaps there's a launch authorization given to our own intercontinental ballistic missiles, and before we know it, we've launched a nuclear salvo and, you know, it's game over there. So those things can happen, and the risks of them are very real in such a way that, you know, when Thomas was refining just war theory, it was honestly inconceivable.
Inconceivable, and also the other thing about just war theory, it, you know, begins sort of with St. Augustine. Every major development of just war theory in the Church's first 1,000 years took place within the context where political authorities were, at least in theory, Catholics. Or Christian. Okay, and so you could appeal to specifically Catholic moral norms and so forth. What do you do when societies, when political arrangements have become utterly Machiavellian, have become part of the Promethean project of Babel? The fatal flaw in just war theory is that the prudential decisions that have to be made are left to the civil authorities. But it's precisely those civil authorities who have a vested interest in manipulating those principles to justify going to war. All right, and so it does present us with an epistemological problem, I think, in that regard. But I want to come back to the Skynet thing. No, we don't have the technology now for Skynet to be a reality, if it ever is. The main hurdle, the main problem is energy. I mean, as we now know, I mean, like data centers require more energy than entire cities and so on. AI is resource dependent, big time, water, electricity. Everything about it is just this giant consumer of energy. And because of the type of energy, it requires a lot of coolant and water and so on. Now, therefore, if AI ever reaches a point where it is able to develop new forms of energy, like zero-point energy, where it simply draws energy from the ambient atmosphere and converts it to usable electricity, then you might reach a stage where the AI can, in a sense, not worry about being unplugged, if you want to put it that way.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, you're still going to have the problem of, you know, no will of its own. But the converse of having no will of your own is that you just become a slave of the master, right? And so, you end up. I don't know. I mean, I'm skeptical on the energy stuff. I don't really think 0-point energy is a possibility. The reality is we've already found virtually unlimited energy in nuclear energy, and
it's true.
we really haven't developed it. You know, there are some nuclear plants around the world, but I mean, Europe sent itself back to the coal age by shutting down most of its nuclear plants. You know, Germany in particular.
They were almost destroyed by Chernobyl.
That's fair. It's a fair point. Yeah, I guess the shadow of Chernobyl is long in more than just a literal sense. So that's a fair point. But yeah, I don't know. It's interesting. If I can offer one critique of the encyclical, it's that I thought it was a bit ham-fisted in articulating some of the Francis stuff. I felt like Pope Leo was trying to and I get it. I totally get it, and I think it's probably a good thing on balance. But it's apparent to me that he's trying to sort of nod to Francis in ways that are not divisive, in ways that give like a wink and a nod to the previous pontificate. And there were just some things in the encyclical that I thought were a bit silly. There was one line, it was on the integral human development stuff. I suspected that Cardinal Czerny was the ghostwriter on this section. It says, here we go. By integral human development, we mean a process in which the growth of individuals and peoples encompasses all dimensions of existence and opens the future to subsequent generations as well. What does that mean? That means almost
it's a word salad.
It's a complete word salad.
It's a word salad. I think that one of the things we have to remember is that there is such a thing as intra-Vatican politics.
Indeed.
And as Pope Benedict himself pointed out, somebody asked him, how much power do you have to change things here in the Curia? And he goes, my power extends to the door of my apartment. And once I walk out that door, I don't really have any power. The fact is, I hate to use this language, I probably shouldn't, but there's a kind of deep state in the Vatican.
Yeah, for sure.
Which is sort of like the entrenched civil service bureaucracy that's been there forever. And it's very gossipy, it's very backstabbing, it's very power-centered, it's very clericalistic. And right now, currently, that Curia is staffed by a lot of Francis appointees. Okay? And so I think Pope Leo understands that if he wants to get anything done of any significance in the coming year or two, until he gets a chance to slowly get his people in place and to make it appear that it's not a putsch, it's not a purge. I'm not purging the Francis people. I'm just slowly replacing them as they get old with different people. Okay, that's the way you do things in the Vatican.
Yeah. It's very wise, very wise.
Exactly. So I think that a lot of this paying homage to Pope Francis, blah, blah, is simply a little bit of papal politics, because he also quotes a lot John Paul II.
Yes.
And if you go back and read Pope Francis's encyclicals, he rarely, if ever, quoted his predecessors, John Paul and Benedict. Rarely, ever. Mm-hmm. Okay? And yet here we have Leo quoting John Paul and Benedict very, very much.
Yeah, that's very telling. Very telling.
Yeah.
There's one. So I don't think this is a missed opportunity, because again, I mean, you can't cover everything in one encyclical. I think this encyclical did a great job at addressing what it set out to do. I do hope there's follow-on encyclicals or teachings, apostolic letters, whatever the case is, things from the CDF about the nature of computer versus human intelligence, et cetera. I think that'd be really good. What do you think about the more clearly articulating the real spiritual stakes that are in front of us? And I'm thinking about this. I just read Rod Dreher's book, Living in Wonder, where he's talking about the realities of the supernatural world. And I
interviewed him on my podcast over that book.
Oh, great. Nice. Book. Yeah, he's supposed to come on mine as well. He's in the middle of a move. He's coming back to the U.S., excitingly. But what do you think about, I had a guest on a couple years ago, and we were talking very speculatively, obviously, about, could AI be the Antichrist, et cetera. But I do think there's a real spiritual component here. I think to deny that there's a real spiritual component is really to not be a Catholic.
Yeah.
So, God is doing something here. I can't overlook this idea of, Babel, confusion of language. Now we've overcome the confusion of language with large language models, and that is sort of the best candidate for the modern Babel. I think there's that's just not a coincidence, right? I think God's hand is in all of this. So maybe as we close, Larry, what do we make of the spiritual moment here? How do we make sense of all this, and how do we avoid either the sort of materialist trap of like, oh no, it's really just about like prudence and not doing stupid things and destroying ourselves, or the overly spiritualist trap of like, I won't touch AI because I just think it's all like inhabited by demons. You know what I mean? What would you say there?
I would say that we need to revisit over and over and over again the not irrelevant encyclicals of Pope John Paul II.
Okay.
Fides et Ratio, Veritatis Splendor, Evangelium Vitae, all of them, Redemptor Hominis. What John Paul left us with was a teaching legacy that I think, sadly, the Francis papacy allowed to just sort of fall into desuetude. The fact is, we have only scratched the surface of retrieving the magisterial legacy of John Paul. Now, why do I want to emphasize? Because his magisterial legacy was that of Gaudium et Spes 22. He quoted it in every encyclical. It was a Christocentric theological anthropology, the very thing Pope Leo is calling for us to do. So if Leo doesn't do it, then we have still the example of Pope John Paul II's Wednesday audience catechesis and so on. I can't emphasize that enough. So I do hope, because my one criticism, as I said, was the Pentecost thing, but it's part of what you just mentioned. I hope we eventually get a document from Leo that goes beyond this sort of pacem in terras, peace to the world, multinational cooperation kind of language, and gets down and dirty in the prophetic elements of critique, of critiquing truth to power, and really confronting this libido dominandi, which you can see is in the encyclical. It's there, but I think it needs to be applied far more forcefully in the future. So I'm with you on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think this encyclical was great, but I think it was sort of 80% prudence and 20% prophecy. And I want that inverse for the next one. I want like an 80% prophetic, 20% prudential encyclical. I think that'd be great. So,
all right.
Well, Larry, it's a pleasure as always. I always learn from you. I always really enjoy our conversations. Thanks so much for joining me.
We could talk you're one of those guys I could talk for hours and hours.
Totally agree. Well, to my listeners, if you've tuned in to this podcast since the last time Larry joined me, please go back and listen to all my episodes with him. He's always a delight, always a treasure trove of wisdom. You can follow his work at gaudiumetsspes22.com, the same blog that we're pretty sure Leo reads, I think, Pope Leo. So if you want to be as well informed as Pope Leo, go check out Larry's blog, gaudiumetsspes22.com. I'm going to include in the show notes his article on Catholic World Report about this encyclical, and include some of the other critiques that we mentioned today, as well as a link to the encyclical itself. Thanks so much for listening. Until next time, God bless you.